All right, everyone. Welcome back. In today's episode, we're going to talk about the difference between internal rate of return and CAGR, or compound annual growth rate. Let's get started. So first on the agenda, we need to really just understand and define what these terms are. So we'll get a brief overview on what IRR is, what CAGR is, and then we'll explore the two with an example and talk about the pros and cons between them. So diving right in, the way that I tend to define IRR is the average annualized rate of return of a given investment over a certain period of time. So while the textbook definition of discount rate that makes net present value equal to zero is true, typically whenever I tell people that's the definition, their eyes just glaze over and I lose them, right? And so the average annual rate of return tends to make a little bit more sense to a lot of folks. So first, let's talk about how we can calculate this. We can calculate in one of two ways. One is using a spreadsheet like Excel or Google Sheets. And we would do this by saying, first, let's use the IRR function and then selecting all cash flows. An alternative is we can use longhand math. And so whether this is setting it up in a calculator, a financial calculator, setting it up within a spreadsheet, or just doing it by hand, I think you would use a function or a set of calculations that looks a lot like this, where we take a given cash flow in some period, N in this case, we'll discount it by the discount rate, IRR, for a certain number of periods. We'll perform that operation as many times as necessary so that we can get the present value of that stream of cash flows, and we'll subtract out the initial investment. And we'll run that math over and over and over again until the present value is exactly equal to the initial investment. So I understand that when I kind of describe it like that, a lot of you are like, all right, great, let's use a spreadsheet. Let's move on and just simply use IRR. So let's pause there and move on to CAGR. So CAGR is the average growth of an investment over a period of time. Now that's a really different distinction to make between the average annual rate of return. In this case, we're really just talking about the growth of a given investment. And that is what this acronym really means, right? It's the compound annual growth rate of an investment. So I think, again, there's two ways for us to think about this. The first is we can use a spreadsheet, we can use the rate function in a spreadsheet, or we can do longhand math. And we could say, given some investment, so the investment at the start, relative to the investment at the end, so what do you get in return, what's that ratio? And we'll raise that ratio to an exponent relative to some period of time, t. So I think really this is where a comparison of the two is important. And again, we can kind of talk a little bit about pros and cons. So the first here is going to be, let's talk about the IRR function, right? What we're trying to isolate is, given a set of cash flows here, how do we discount those cash flows to figure out what they're worth, compare them to the initial investment, and from there determine IRR? Now the distinction is, what does cash flow really mean? What does that refer to? So yes, it is cash flows from resale. Like when you sell the property, it includes those cash flows, but it also includes cash flows from operations. So when your tenants pay you money and you pay out expenses, whatever is left over, those operating cash flows are also included here. That's not the case with CAGR. So let's look at a quick example. So here, let's calculate IRR. So we'll say equals IRR, open parentheses, and we'll select all cash flows. CAGR is a little different, where we only take the end points, what we sell it for, and we compare it to what we bought it for. So in this case, we're doing longhand math, where we raise it to the exponent relative to, in this case, 4 years worth of time. But I think it's important to point out that the IRR is including all those interim operating cash flows that you received. CAGR doesn't. CAGR is only looking at what you bought it for and what you sold it for. Now, just to illustrate the use of the rate function to prove that it works the same way, we can use this time value of money function to help us calculate it. So we'll say equals rate, the number of periods, the interim payments, in this case there aren't any, what we bought it for, and what we sold it for. So this, I think, really helps illustrate the difference between them, and then ultimately the pros and cons between them. So IRR includes these interim cash flows, CAGR doesn't. IRR measures total return, not just return from appreciation, right? Now, if what you're trying to figure out is how much of my return came from appreciation, you'd have to isolate it in some way. CAGR can do that for you. I think simplicity is also important here. CAGR is really easy to calculate. You don't have to build out this big pro forma to do so. IRR, you probably have to take some extra steps. And I think the time value of money component is important to this, right? Where we think about how IRR is inclusive of the individual contribution of all cash flows from all sources from all time. CAGR misses some of that by removing operating cash flow and only looking at the amount of time it took for a certain amount of appreciation to take place. So just to recap, IRR and CAGR, they're both important return metrics. IRR is a more comprehensive or inclusive return metric, but maybe that's not what you're looking for. And if you need something that really measures and isolates only the amount of appreciation, CAGR is the way to go. As always, I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you learned something. Thank you for taking the time to watch it, and I'll see you in the next one. Thanks.